So if we can get everyone to their seats, we'll make our EAC overlords happy. And we'll get going. Well, great. I'm Charles Stewart. Welcome everybody back to the second session, both those in the room and those of you watching the webcast from the beach, wherever you are. I'm sure that's the primary audience today from afar. We have an excellent panel today to talk about, moving on to talking about Election Day. Being a professor from MIT, oh, by the way, I didn't mention where I'm from. I'm Charles Stewart. I'm professor of political science at MIT and the director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. Being the guy from MIT, I've been tasked with letting y'all know about the Wi-Fi situation. I don't know if they've actually changed the paper on the tables, but if you look for the CCP WLAN as a network, not as a password, but as a network. That's the network you're looking for, and there should be no password needed. So again, that's CCP, 2 C's, not 3, WLAN, and no password should be needed. So, so there you go. Let's get going and to talk about Election Day and Election Day preparation. We have 4 panelists who will be talking about a number of interesting topics. Just as a way of kind of getting into the topic, you know, Election Day is the day when you know there's really no margin of error. If an election official is not prepared, it's not like they can say, well, let's just do it tomorrow. If an emergency strikes, if something bad happens, an option isn't to delay things. The show must go on, and so Election Day preparations are really, really important. In my work as a political science following election administration, you know, I got my interest in this area after the 2000 election, which is true of a lot of academics. And one of the things that I've learned over the last nearly 20 years now of studying elections and studying problems that show up in elections is that actually it looks like on most metrics, on almost every metric, whether it be in the quality of the voting machines, the quality of the registration systems, the quality of polling place practices, on the quality of vote counting, election administration has gotten better. Undeniably over the last 20 years. There's a lot of, I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's pockets where work really needs to be done, but it is, I think, true, and I would defend the proposition that things have gotten a lot better. And one of the reasons why I find this kind of amazing is that elections have also gotten a lot more complicated in the process. It's not only that we have new challenges because of security concerns, because of the role of technology, but also because kind of election administration has helped to complexify things itself. In the 2000 election, for instance, 90% of all the votes cast at the 2000 election were cast on Election Day. Now only 60% are cast on Election Day. 40% are cast either in early voting or by the mails. And so, and then the Election Day voting itself is complicated by vote centers and other types of new ways of voting. So things have gotten a lot more complicated, and things are getting better. So how can you get greater complication and yet improve service overall? Well, one of the ways you can do it is by working smarter. And so one of the trends that I've noticed over the last 20 years is an increased professionalization of the field, bringing people into election administration who have technical backgrounds, who have backgrounds outside of elections, but maybe in business and logistics, in areas where the job is to get things done. And to analyze the situation and to work smartly. And that's really, I think, the big theme of this panel is how can election administrators work smartly in an increasingly complex election day environment, and more broadly in a more complicated election administration environment. And so, so we're we're going to be listening to some folks who've thought about how to work in this environment. I'll just very quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get going. There are longer biographies in the packets that you all have gotten, so I won't read them extensively. To my far right and to your left, the first is Neal Kelley, who's the Registrar of Voters in Orange County, Florida. Neal serves the voters of Orange County, Orange County, California. I oftentimes give him the wrong name, and that's an honest, so it's an honest mistake since I grew up in Orange County, Florida. It's a 3,000-mile mistake, and we both used to have oranges in our county, but we don't so much anymore because of a mouse who infiltrated both of those counties. Anyway, Neal is the Registrar of Elections in Orange County, California, which is the 5th largest voting jurisdiction in the United States. Neal has held a number of offices, both at the state and national levels, and has won a number of awards and has been recognized for his sterling business leadership in elections over the years. Next to me is Benjamin Uminsky, who's the Project Manager, Business Intelligence Competency Center of Los Angeles, California. Ben joined the LA County Registrar Recorder County Clerk's Office in 2007, where he worked as an HR analyst for 6 years. He joined the department's executive office in 2013 to head up the newly created data analytics program, where he had been working on various data science projects involving revenue forecasting, poll worker classification modeling, voter file duplicate identification, et cetera. He has flown the coop. Good for LA County, other parts, but maybe bad for elections. He's recently left the Registrar's office to work for the LA County Department of Health Services and their business intelligence unit doing many of the same things he did for elections. Immediately to my left is Melissa Frey, the Special Assistant to the Director of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. Melissa currently serves the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as the Special Assistant to the Director of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, PEMA. She joined PEMA in December of 2016, where she has been able to combine her unique background in strategy development, finance, as well as program data and crisis management to lead PEMA's Office of Policy and Doctrine. And then finally, there's Mark I never know if it's Goins or Goins, so you tell us.
Either's fine.
Oh, yeah. Okay, we're going to pin you down one day. He's currently the coordinator of elections for the state of Tennessee, having been appointed by Secretary of State Trey Hargett in 2009. And then he's also the past chair of the EAC's Standards Board. Before that, he served on before being the coordinator of elections, he served on the State Election Commission in the aughts from 2005 to 2009. And before that, he was in the Tennessee House of Representatives. And I just discovered that, unfortunately, he was gerrymandered out of representing Rocky Top, Tennessee, which is my favorite song from the state and one of my favorite places. So, but when he was in the legislature, he also served on the elections subcommittee. So we have an interesting and varied panel, and we'll jump into the first presentation from Neal Kelley.
Great, thank you, Charles, and thank you to the EAC and the officials here from Pennsylvania for putting this on. I think this is fantastic, and thank you for the invite. So I want to focus on the use of data for utilizing logistics on Election Day and pre-Election Day, and how we have used data over the last 10 years or so to really inform the decisions that we're making leading up to Election Day, and then looking at the metrics post-Election Day to see if that's actually working. I want to walk you through a couple of things here just in terms of the pre-story and the history of how we got to where we are today. So I took over the office in 2005, and when I did so, the booths that we send out to the field and the polling places, and by the way, in Orange County we have 1,200 polling places roughly, and we utilize about 12,000 pieces of equipment. So it's a large operation, and those would go out in caddies, steel containers, and so you would have 8 booths in those steel containers, and it was much easier to ship them that way. So that's the way it was being done when I got there, and I let a cycle go through of that and thought, this is strange, why are we doing it this way? And it really hit home because in 2006 I had a Senate election, a very contested election where we had some very high turnout that we didn't predict. And we had lots of lines in 2006 because we didn't have enough booths in the polling places. And so I wanted to relook at that, and that's kind of the precursor to where we started using data in a different way. So because of those lines, we started to look at historical turnout at the precinct level and started trying to do some forecasting at the precinct level and then changing the way that we shipped the booths themselves. And I have to give some props to the brilliant mind of Professor Stewart because we're utilizing his tool right now from MIT, and I'll get into that a little bit later, and it's actually been fantastic for us. So the booths themselves that you can see one there on the screen are configured to be shipped in a variety of different ways. And like I said, we were doing it 8 at a time in these steel caddies. But in reality, we could ship these 2 at a time, all the way up to 16 at a time, depending on what's needed in the polling place. And that's what we wanted to start doing, was sending out configurations to a polling place that may have low turnout, a couple of booths, versus a very high turnout polling place where we may have 2 setups or 16 booths total. By the way, some of you, the election officials, I'm sure know this as well. When you send 2 booths to a poll worker who's done it for a long time, they freak out, because they're used to seeing 8 booths, and it's a big change for them. But I'll get into a little bit of that later. District boundaries are also changing the complexity of how we're sending out booths, and this is really happening right now with the district palooza, I like to call it, because we're going from a lot of at-large districts to district-based elections. In Orange County right now, we're working on 15 jurisdictions that are changing between now and November, and we have 400 ballot styles in Orange County that really change the dynamics of the number of booths that are sent out. Some of you in the room may send multiple ballot styles to a single polling place. I won't do that. So if it has a ballot style, it's going to have 1 ballot style within that polling place. And you can see there just on that map, we have 400 different ballot styles on average throughout the county. So the data preparation itself, what is the data that we're looking at to make these logistical decisions? And that's what I want to jump into. Projected turnout. So we wanted to start forecasting turnout by precinct so that we could have a better handle on what we might expect to show up on Election Day and what we might have in terms of the equipment that we would need on Election Day. And so we first started looking at registration trends. And this is a heat map of Orange County, but I want to just orient you here for a second. So that's Surf City, USA, Huntington Beach, so the coast is to the left of that. And then I put the happiest place on earth, which some might argue is this room today, but this is the Disneyland on the West Coast, Anaheim. So that kind of gives you an idea of the location. But when I start to put in, this is like a building thunderstorm, the density of the voters in Orange County really are concentrated in the north central part of the county. And those really hot red orange areas mean that there are 5,000 voters per square mile in Orange County in those particular areas. Just to give you some perspective, we have 1,000 square miles in Orange County compared to San Bernardino County, which I think has 8,000 or 9,000 square miles. But we have 3.2 million people packed into that 1,000 square miles. We have much better weather than Los Angeles County and less traffic. So if you're ever out that way, come down to Orange County. So anyway, when you look at the density there, this starts to give us the layer that we use to start forecasting what the turnout is going to be. And data forecasting, I think, is very interesting. I like to use the weather analogy because if you get the next day weather forecast, it's usually pretty accurate. 85% of the time it's accurate. If you go 10 days out, it's about 17% accurate because you don't have as much data inputs coming in. And it's the same thing with what we're dealing with. The more data inputs that we can get, the better forecast we can provide. So on that historical turnout, when we took that density of those voters and started looking at 10 years worth of data, going back 10 years per precinct, we were able to start predicting some forecasts going from 25% turnout all the way to a 75% turnout. I want to point out two things to you about this map in particular. If you drew a circle around Orange County, along the coast and up around the borders of Los Angeles County, we were predicting some very high turnout in those areas. The density of voters, not as high along the coast, but the engagement of the voters is much higher in those areas. So that was one thing. The other is right in the middle of that hotspot, you see a lot of blue there. That's the city of Santa Ana. Very dense voter population, but not a lot of engagement in terms of turnout generally. And that's going to change here in just a second. Then we brought in time studies, because this is one of the things that we need to be able to use the optimization calculator that Charles has provided election officials. And so we started using every ballot style, or an average of ballot styles in every election to conduct time tests, because that's really important. A couple of things about time tests on the ballots. The first is that you need it for that optimization calculator, and the second is how many votes can be stored on a VVPAT roll. I'm not sure if you use paper trail here in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, I don't know that. But in California, we use them, and in a California ballot, you can typically get about 120 votes on a roll of paper. That's really important to know on election day in terms of being prepared for that. So when you look at the times, and I just wanted to give you a quick sample here of these random time studies. This is from 2016. The sweet spot right there is that average, 8.25 minutes to vote that ballot. That's what we used for that calculator. Now we go to the inputs. I'm getting the hook here, so I'm going to go as quick as I can. So using these data inputs, we use the queuing calculations. And by the way, this is basic queuing theory. Charles has distilled it for election officials, which is fantastic. But you can use, if you don't use that, you can use other queuing calculators. It works well. So I want to use an example from Irvine, California. Irvine is one of our largest cities in Orange County. It's right there in the middle, and you can just see that hot spot of dense voters in one particular area of Irvine. So that's where most of our polling places are located. But the example I want to use is a small polling place in a very large precinct. It serves a lot of voters, but not a lot of density in terms of the voters. So it was a good example to give you. So what we did in the calculation, we had 390 voters that turned out in the 2012 election. We forecast for 2016 an 80% increase. That may sound significant. It is. But you're not taking into account the history of voters that are new voters, that are registered voters since 2012. We don't have their history, so we don't know what the turnout is going to be necessarily. Plus, there's a lot of vote-by-mail usage, and we backed a lot of that out. But at any rate, we ended up with 702 predicted turnout for that particular area. We then used an 8-hour span for calculating 84 voters per hour. Why not 13? Because that's the length of our election day. Well, you don't have busy times on certain points of the day, so we're averaging it out to an 8-hour day. So 84 votes per hour for the arrival time. And based on that, we plugged in 8.25 minutes for the time to vote. We established a 15-minute wait time with a 90% service level, meaning 90% of the time people are not waiting more than 15 minutes. And that gave us a booth count of 13. If I go over 12 in my jurisdiction, I have to add a second setup, so we backed out one booth and sent them 12. They used to get 8. So how did it work? I just want to show you real quickly how it worked. What we did is we then took this data in all of the 2,700 precincts that I've got in Orange County, and we did the exact same process that I just showed you in that Irvine example. And that gave us calculations from 4 booths all the way to 16 booths that we would be shipping throughout the county. And measuring the outcomes obviously is important for all of us. A couple of things to consider: the number of booths that you have. That may change how you're doing it. The facility size. If you send them 16 booths, obviously sometimes they can't handle 16 booths. We get that. The number of votes per the paper trail. That's important. The bottlenecks generally are the check-in stations. This is probably not breaking news to all of you, but that certainly is where the choke point is. And so if you can add more check-in stations, that really helps. In that cube, the sweet spot is right in the middle there in those colors, because if we go to those variations on the outside, we missed our forecast, right? So when you look at the map, this is 2016. Overall, we did pretty well. When you draw that circle around the map, our forecast was pretty much on the money. We were able to send the right amount of booths to the right number of polling places based on data, not on gut feeling, based on actual data. The thing that killed me, though, was right there in the middle of Santa Ana. Remember I told you at the beginning we were forecasting a low turnout? We actually had a very high turnout because they were energized, irregardless of which side you're on in the Trump campaign, they were energized with that election. And they turned out in very large numbers, caught us a little bit off guard, but we still were able to handle it. And as a result, we had reports of 17 polling places with long lines. That's out of 1,200 polling places. So it does work. One last pitch, and I'm going to turn it back over. Because this is a data summit, I encourage you to visit our website. We put every available amount of data that is publicly available on the website. And this is what you can see in these data-rich tabs that you can click through. And we're now doing it in real time for data visualizations as well. ocvote.com. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Neal. Ben.
Sorry, that's my advertising.
No, that's all good.
You got to lord it over the LA County people, I guess.
All right, well, before I jump into my presentation, I'd like for most of you to start thinking about, I'm going to be presenting an interesting data analytic that uses what we call machine learning. Some of you are more familiar perhaps with some of the more hype terms in this field, like artificial intelligence. I'm not going to use that term. But there is an inherent danger in the analytic that we've created. And so I'd like, as I jump into my actual presentation, you'll see a number of different slides. Start thinking about what would be the inherent danger to this approach. And we'll talk about it a little bit later as well. Because I think it's important to realize that while data can be very, very powerful and a very useful tool, if used inappropriately or unwittingly, it could ultimately replicate patterns that you don't want to replicate. Okay, so let me go ahead and jump into this. So I guess I'll have to point. Thank you. So ultimately, all of us have to find enough poll workers to work on election day. And for us, the problem is whether or not we can find enough folks to staff close to 4,600 precincts on election day. And that usually amounts to trying to find close to 26,000, upwards of 30 to 33,000 per large election. Number of people that would be willing to show up and spend about 13 hours of their time for a very small stipend that we give them. So the inherent problems with this is as we recruit these people, folks cancel last minute. The worst situation for us is when they no-show, no call, no anything. It's particularly problematic, I guess for those of you that administer elections, you know how problematic it is if it's the inspector that doesn't show up on election day with materials and supplies. So if that happens, where too many folks don't show up, we might end up with some long lines. And we might have folks grumbling about these types of issues, which of course leads to other issues such as low voter turnout and so on and so forth. So these are terrible outcomes that we're all trying to avoid, of course. So, let me just be clear. I have received some criticisms about this slide. What I mean by optimal selection is optimal for us is a physical human being that is showing up on election day and wants to work, right? Irrespective of any demographic, political leaning, anything to that effect.
Tacky sweater.
So, right, all that notwithstanding. So we really do want to find the folks that are excited to be there providing wonderful service on election day to our voters. So the question for us is, how do we find these people, right? Without having to call 35, 40,000 different folks. So I started with looking at a lot of historical data, and I think it's a very similar process to what Neal was talking about, looking at historical outcomes of who's showing up, who's not showing up. And ultimately, we ended up using, I think, data going as far back as 2000 to train the algorithm that we had created. And we used the 2014 election as our test data. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But ultimately, what we were finding is, without using any fancy algorithm, just simply our recruiters' intuition, we were winding up with a 67% success rate for recruitment, meaning of all the people we called to try to recruit them, 67% were indeed sticking to their commitment or not telling us politely or impolitely, no thank you, or whatever else that they tell us. And then that was for the November, and then for June, we were at 78%. So clearly, there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of having better recruitment success rates for our poll workers. So for us, when we were starting off on this data analytic project, we were asking ourselves a number of different questions. One of the core questions being, how do we really differentiate between those that are committed versus those that are not committed? In many cases, our poll workers are just looking at a list of folks that had worked previously. So the natural intuition is, oh, they worked last time, they're going to work this time. That can be true. It could also not be true. And so the question for us is, are there other data elements that lend themselves to predicting the truthiness of, that, ultimately? So we really want to know of the intuitions that our poll workers have developed. And mind you, you probably all have very talented poll worker recruiters that have gotten to know their poll workers and the folks that come and show up and have a sense as to, oh, if I call this person, they'll show up. Oh, this is the wrong election. I shouldn't call Fred, right? So there's some really good intuition. So in terms of data, how do we model those intuitions from the data that we've collected on poll worker recruitment? And importantly, beyond those intuitions that our poll workers have developed, are there additional data patterns that could be mathematically derived when applying a machine learning type of algorithm? So ultimately, the goal of this project, and this is the most important thing that I'd like to leave all of you with, not so much which algorithm use or not use, but when using data, it's important to have a very clear definition of what your business problem is. So what are you trying to solve? And the clearer and more defined that problem is, the better results you're going to get. The less ambiguous the data is going to be, the more accurate whatever it is that you're creating is going to wind up being. So for us, the question isn't, could we find enough people to work? Because ultimately, we were recruiting from a list of about 120,000, right? And then beyond that list, we have about 5.2 million people that could potentially serve as poll workers in LA County. So there's a huge pool to recruit from. But for us, we wanted to minimize, so the business problem for us was minimizing the negative outcomes that were occurring on election day, being cancellations, no-shows, so on and so forth. And the reason why we settled on that was we felt that the costs of incorrectly identifying a negative outcome as a positive was much greater than the exact opposite situation, where if we were to miss out on certain poll workers, there's a lot of other folks we could recruit from. But if we were to get it wrong and get the wrong people, then we could wind up with long lines, we could wind up with poll locations not be open, emergency openings, so on and so forth. So the question for us in terms of data and data elements that were available to us is, what can we use? So some of the things that we know about our poll workers are obviously some demographic data that we collect from the voter file. We know gender and we know age. Do we know anything about civic participation? Because this is an important thing in which we would think would drive participation by a poll worker is, are they civic-minded? Are they part of that community? And we ultimately realized that of all the metrics that were out there, or imagined metrics that we would love to have data on, the most important one was voter participation. Are they an engaged voter? So we found that, and of all the data elements that we end up using, voter participation is probably the best predictor for whether or not they're going to show up and be a poll worker. Likewise, does previous poll worker history predict future poll worker history? We have all the data. And yes, to some extent it does. It's an important predictor, but it's not the most important predictor. Likewise, is there a question about long distance traveling, right? So would someone want to travel from the top of LA County to the bottom of LA County? It's a very large county. Probably not. Likewise, we also have the specific data that tells us what was the outcome. We call it the response data. At the end of all this, of all the patterns that existed, we realized there wasn't just one pattern. I won't get into how we discovered these additional patterns, but for us, we realized that there were 6 types of different poll workers that existed that could all be predicted on. So we didn't want to throw everyone into the same mix and predict the end result. We wanted to split things up and get better results, and that ended up working. Thanks. Okay, so I won't get too data sciencey here, but I guess the fair question would be, well, what is a prediction algorithm doing, right? At the end of all this, the end output is just one data point. That's what it's doing. It's creating a score between 0 and 1, its likelihood of showing up or not showing up. So in any case of any of these types of classification problems, if it's greater than 50%, that's the positive. If it's less than 50%, that's the negative. Now for us, if you guys remember, that wasn't the business problem that we were trying to solve. We were trying to minimize our negative outcomes. So 50% plus 1 isn't good enough for us. So as we developed the different thresholds, we realized that we wanted to set that 50% much higher, closer, maybe 80% for certain groups. So not every one of the 6 groups that we had created had the same threshold. It differed based on the data. But that was the idea. And by setting the threshold higher, if you guys can imagine, it just means you're being more discriminating with the actual algorithm. So we ended up using machine learning. I listed 2 of many that we used. Anyone that wants to geek out afterwards, I'm happy to talk about gradient boosting and random forest. I won't do that right now. Okay, so what were some of the results? I'm sure you guys are wondering. Before I get to 2016, 2014, obviously we didn't have the algorithm at the time. We used it as test data. Using the algorithm, we moved from a 67% success rate to closer to 86% overall outcome. That's only test data, though. It wasn't a real election. It was just simply giving the algorithm new data it had never seen for 2014. And then the general election, the primary election, we moved from 73 or 75% to about 88, 89%. So clearly, it's performing the way we intended to, just have a higher success rate. And the no-shows and cancellation rates were also minimized closer to 1% and 2%, whereas before, without the algorithm, we were right around 10 to 13% no-show and cancellation. And we don't want to be there. So moving on to a real election, this is now the algorithm being used on a live election. For the June 2016 primary, the ultimate success rate that we saw without using the algorithm was 73.6%. The no-show rate was around 13%, and the cancellation rate was around 11.1%. Why am I differentiating? Well, like any kind of new technology, adoption's not going to be 100%. So we had a few different groups that we were able to look at. Those poll workers that did not want to use the algorithm versus those that did. So in this case, the overall success rate without the algorithm is what you see. With the algorithm, we went from low 70% to 85%. So for those poll workers that were actually using the algorithm, they were seeing a much higher benefit to their success rates. Lower no-show rates of those folks that they recruited, lower cancellation rates as well. Next. Similar data for November 2016. I won't go ahead and explain all the A, Bs, and Cs. Those are just status that we use. What matters, though, is for the 2016, without the algorithm, we had a success rate of 71.7%, no-show rates around 6.4%, cancellation rates around 6.2%. With the algorithm, 83%, only 1.9% no-show rate, 4.9% cancellation rate. So in all cases, across multiple elections, the algorithm outperforms, I don't want to use this term outperforms the human, because I'm not suggesting we move to robots, but using the tool versus not using the tool, those recruiters that were using the tool are experiencing greater successes in staffing those precincts. And that's the whole point of what we were trying to do with this algorithm. So, as I think Charles had noted, I no longer work for the Registrar Recorder doing this wonderful work. I still work at LA County doing health services. I wanted to provide contact info for the data scientist that I work with and train that is still there doing the same work. She has wonderful ideas. She knows these algorithms as well as I do. For those of you that have immediate concerns or immediate questions that I'm not able to answer today about this type of use, that is her contact information as well.
Thanks.
All right.
Melissa. So we have a question up here about which clicker is the one that's supposed to be working. This one? Or?
No, not mine.
Okay, not yours.
No.
Okay, well here, let's try this one and see if it.
Let's see what happens.
Let's see what happens.
Oh, great. I don't think so.
Well, we need to get the,
There we go. Oh, and now we're ahead. Okay. First, before I get started, I'd just like to say, now that I'm at Pima, but this is like coming home because I used to work at Pennsylvania Department of State, and it's great to see so many faces here. I'd like to thank the EAC team and the Department of State team that really worked hard to pull all of this together, and for all of you to be here and for valuing exactly what we're trying to figure out to do to help everything kind of improve. I'm going to be talking today about emergency preparedness and elections. I'd like to thank Neal, actually, for helping open the doorway to my presentation with all the talk of forecasting. So when Pima operates within an emergency management structure, we have 5 phases that we work in. It's our prevent, prepare, respond, recover, and mitigation. The Department of State actually works in very similar ways in preparing for, executing, and then following up with after actions after an election. So it only makes sense for all of us to work together. We'll activate our CRCC, which is our Commonwealth Response Coordination Center. And that is basically our EOC in the Commonwealth. And we'll bring in other departments that I'll talk about a little bit later on. But it allows us to be able to support the mission of Department of State on election day, both primary and general. Another primary threats for the election day and or in general that Pima faces when coordinating with the other agencies enterprise-wide are flash flooding, extended closure of limited access or core routes, hazmat, human-caused events, power outages, or phone outages. Everyone kind of immediately nowadays is currently thinking cyber, but these are the everyday environments that can cause flash flooding down power lines. You can have a hazmat event that would make a polling place inaccessible. So these are different environments. Really? I think I'm the loudest person in the room and they still have to push a microphone closer to me? So anyhow, thank you. What we're going to look at data-wise for today really is kind of one of the things that's most important. It's climatology. So if we look at the history of Pennsylvania from the late 50s till present day, we will be able to know that in April and May, which are the months of our primaries, and November for our general elections, we have a higher probability of wind, hail, and tornadic activity during those months. So knowing that and going in, we're going to want to be able to coordinate with our emergency management coordinators in the 67 counties, just as there are the 67 election directors, and we're in the process of trying to marry those groups together and make sure that they're communicating the way we are at Pima with the Department of State to support that mission on election day. One of the other things that's very interesting is if we look at climatology, we can see that as the atmosphere builds during the day, the primary release tends to really start to happen around 2 p.m. and follow through until just after 8 p.m. That's one of the primary voting windows. You're talking about, you know, rush hour traffic, trying to get Johnny to soccer practice and doing all of those things. You add in a weather environment and that can change a voter's entire day. It can impact the polling place in very unique ways, which we'll look at as we go forward. There are a few more slides in this presentation that I'm going to kind of go by a little quickly, but I wanted you to have the information for after to be able to look at. But again, you can see here that April and May, we see an uptick in hail reports, as well as same time frame in the evening, and the same with tornadic activities. And that doesn't necessarily mean a tornado, but it could mean the environment for one to be created. And so we also see that it's also the same time of day. And this is just a slide identifying since 1950 the types of tornadoes that we've had in the Commonwealth and that are primarily EF1s. So what we're looking at here was actually, it's a slide within a slide. We do a morning briefing at Pima with the enterprise, with the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and its partner agencies. Our state meteorologist is probably one of the best tools we have in the Commonwealth, not just for election day, but in general. And it's really an example of how government that works. So our state meteorologist will put this together and brief everyone. This was the forecast on Monday the 14th this year for primary election day on Tuesday, May 15th. If you look at the center slide, the center image, I should say, you see that the storm system is kind of covering a good portion of the Commonwealth. But we all know that weather can change very dramatically. So now, what was the forecast and what did it look like on Tuesday on the morning of the election? The storm system changed dramatically. You can see that the time frames of when they were expected to come through was going to change. You could see that the coverage area changed as well. This storm system ended up going up into New York State, down through the Maryland line, and crossed from the west to the southeast. So what does that mean? Let's actually look at what we were able to pull from our raw data and go through GIS and figure out what this means. So these are real case scenarios that happened on May 15th. These are epicenters of all of our major cities with a 5 to 10 mile radius around them. One of the things that we do is work closely with the Department of State, and just days prior to the primary or the general election, they send PEMA an updated list of all the polling places within the Commonwealth. That's this image. This is every single polling place within the Commonwealth for the May 15th primary this year. The next thing I'm going to be adding in is our weather events. So the weather intensified throughout the course of the day and this storm. Basically, it hit Dauphin County and Harrisburg around the 5:30 hour and continued on a southeasterly trajectory across the Commonwealth. Again, going from New York to Maryland, you could not avoid this storm. This exactly follows along the climatology information we just talked about. In Wayne County, up in the far northeast, we had an EF1 tornado with 105-mile-an-hour winds. We also had the same conditions and an EF1 tornado at 105 miles an hour in Cumberland County that came through. There were downpours, outages, and we have to look and consider what the continuity plans are for the election directors and what's going on in their areas. Do they have generators? What do they need for their voting systems? How do we support that mission both at PEMA, and then how do we work with our 67 county EMCs as well as our 911 coordinators? We reach out to them a week before or a little bit more depending on the weather environment, and we talk to our 911 coordinators and our emergency management coordinators in the counties and advise them of anything that could potentially impact a polling place. And on election day, primary or general, we have a specific contact in our 24-hour watch within our CRCC, within the building at PEMA, that coordinates and communicates directly to Department of State and lets them know what's happening and what's coming through. We also work with the PUC for the Public Utility Commission to find out where the power outages are so that we can communicate those as well to Department of State should it impact any polling locations. And what does that mean? So when we talk about PUC and we talk about power outages, this is just a snapshot of that day. Okay, so as I had mentioned, the storms intensified as they went through Dauphin County and then towards the east. You can see obviously red bad, green good, okay? But then you can see that this is Med-Ed, PICO, and PP&L, just a sampling of them. But you can see where the power outages were massive. We had over 16,000 power outages pretty much between the 6 and 8 p.m. hours in Montgomery County. You can look up in Wayne County and see where the EF1 tornado came through, that we had 5,300 power outages in that area. So we want to be able to communicate that information to Department of State so that they can communicate to the county election directors and vice versa with the EMCs and the 911 coordinators in their counties. So what are we doing next? How are we, I always have problems with those. What are we doing next as a Commonwealth, as an entire entity? Because when we activate our EOC, when we activate that CRCC on primary day and election day, there are multiple agencies there. Department of Military and Veterans Affairs are there, Governor's Office of Homeland Security, the PUC for Public Utilities Commission, and then we communicate all of that information. So right now, PEMA, Department of State, and a number of our other agencies are currently putting our 2018 November general election plan together. The next step is going to be trying to figure out a way, and we've already opened those lines of communication between the 67 county emergency management coordinators and 911 coordinators with the election directors, because we want at the county everyone to be talking to make sure that they're talking the same way that PEMA is talking with Department of State to support their mission on election day. Beyond that, Department of State and PEMA have come together for some regular meetings to talk about how we can improve more in the real world as well as in data sharing through face-to-face meetings, through an increase in technology, both before, during, and after an election. Some of that is also including the possibility, very early discussions of creating a singular dashboard that would allow all of the stakeholders and parties to be involved, where we could upload information from PennDOT, Pennsylvania, the Turnpike, from 511, so that you can look at where there are traffic incidents and infrastructure, and they can see all of that information as well as outages and other information that's coming through. And the next thing is, be prepared. What are you doing to be prepared? Do you know where all of your polling location, alternate locations are? If not, think about that. When you do have your alternate polling locations, do you truly have your communication plan organized to be able to communicate that to voters within those precincts so that every voter has the opportunity to vote, not realizing that the polling location has moved? So those are things that are really important that you want to stop and think about. And we're open to having that conversation. Department of State is open to having that conversation. And we'd look forward to being able to kind of help as we go forward.
Thanks. Now, Mark.
Well, it seems like we're having an issue with the clicker again.
Good, it wasn't just me.
It just give them a second. I think there's there you go.
No, we need to go back. If you could go back to the cover.
Excellent.
All right. I am Mark Goins. I am from the great state of Tennessee, and there truly is a Rocky Top, by the way. And I grew up 20 minutes away from Rocky Top. And in Tennessee, I like to think we have a positive attitude. So I realized during this election season that it can be very stressful. And you know, I always relate elections to Cracker Jacks. You never know what the surprise is going to be that day, but something's coming at you. I just encourage you to choose to have a great day. Every morning, wake up and say, I'm going to have a great day. And I also encourage you to choose to learn something today. And being from Tennessee, we are very, family friendly in that I always start the presentation off with introducing my wife and letting individuals know who my wife is. So there's my wife. I'm Dolly Parton's trophy husband. You've always wanted to know what he looks like, and I'm him. No, we're very proud of Dolly. I'm not married to her. I have a lovely wife, Rebecca, but anyway, Tennessee is certainly known for Dolly Parton and other things. I got invited to do this a panel, essentially, and I was told the topic would be about a tabletop, or to go into a tabletop discussion. And part of the reason was we recently did a tabletop with all of our election officials in Tennessee on a county level, essentially 400 individuals, and that's a photo of 400 individuals in the room doing a tabletop exercise. And I was very blessed in that we were able to get a lot of ideas from the Harvard project at D3P, and I know MIT has been involved in that as well. They gave us some tools to conduct a tabletop. Now, in all candor, the tabletop that we didn't have, it wasn't all data, but I'm going to go through in just a moment on how it could be all data. It certainly had a data component to it. But essentially, if you're not familiar with an election tabletop, the way that ours worked was during phase one, you would study for an election, you would plan for an election. We literally gave everyone a notebook. They had to put their plans. We divide them up in teams of 10, and they had to come up with a plan on how to prepare for an election, and then on election day, they had to execute that plan. And part of that, though, we were going to hit them with various, what we call injects. For example, in our inject, we hit them with the tornado. Yeah. We wanted to know if they planned beforehand, and if they didn't plan that in phase one, then in phase two, they were in trouble. And basically, for our tabletop exercise, it was the worst election we could imagine. If anything could go wrong, it happened. But how we did incorporate data, and what was very important in that phase one, was we did give them a budget. But we also, during that time period, we told them early turnout is going to be high. So we told them that information. But we also told them during that time that 21 states had been scanned by a foreign actor. So we gave them a choice. They could reduce polling locations or early voting sites, and I'll go into early voting in Tennessee in just a moment because I realize Pennsylvania is a little different than Tennessee in this aspect, but I know there's folks watching across the nation. So anyway, they had a choice. They could save money by reducing voting sites, but the problem with that would be later on they're going to have long lines. Or, and they could take that money and put it to cybersecurity. Or they could do just the opposite, you know, and not spend any money for cybersecurity. And guess what? On Election Day, they're going to have a cyber activity. So data was involved. But overall, as we go through this, as we're looking forward, and I may do a data tabletop, and in doing a data tabletop, some of the relevant things we'd have to throw at them, we'll all deal with data, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I want to make this statement, and maybe this is the one thing you learned from my presentation, and I truly believe this. As an election official, if you do not use data, you do not know how to plan an election. And I truly believe that. As we go through this, let's talk about it. So what data is relevant? Now, for a tabletop, of course, we would throw them irrelevant data, and then we'd throw them relevant data. Well, you have a finite number of poll books. You're going to have a finite number of machines, a finite number of poll officials, but data can change. For example, as I shared with you in Tennessee, we do have an early voting period that starts 20 days before the election, and in general, with very few exceptions, will end 5 days before the election. So sometimes that relevant data at the beginning of the process can change as you go through it. Let me give you an example. If we were doing a tabletop exercise, polling location number 1, we might say that, well, they're having a 60% turnout during early voting. You have a finite number of voters, but 60% of those are turning out. Polling location number 2, when we look at that, turnout is extremely low. Well, in the planning phase as an election official, now you have that data, but you also need more information, or at least I would take more information. What I would do, I would go then and look and say, was there something on that ballot in precinct number 1 that's causing that turnout? Or is the situation there's a candidate there that has got a strong get out the vote effort? Because it may be that you're going to run out of voters in precinct number 1 and you can shift resources to number 2. Or it may be that you have a weak ballot in number 2 and you need to shift the ballot, the resources that you have, poll officials, whatever the case may be, to polling location number 1. You also have a finite number of money. And money is always going to be an issue in an election. There's so many things that we can do that would be great, but you also have to take that in to connect in context with money. Polling locations, that's obviously relevant data that you have. Vendors can be an excellent troubleshoot for you as well as provide data. For example, we had an issue one time with poll books where unfortunately the wrong early voting data had been loaded, so on election day it appeared some individuals had voted and they had not. Well, now we require our e-poll book vendors to put that data on the opening page of the e-poll book. So if I have an e-poll book, I know how many of my voters have voted early. I also know from the Election Commission, they've sent data showing this is how many people voted early. And if those do not match up, then we know we have an issue. And of course, we test that before we send that out to the polling locations. Length of ballot. Sometimes you have to create your data. Now, if we were setting up a tabletop, the only thing we would give them would be a very long ballot. And in Tennessee, every 8 years, that's exactly what we have. Every judicial race is on the ballot. It's a retention type election, and so it's very long. So how do you create that data? Well, we wouldn't tell them, but my hope would be when they were doing their planning, they would do a mock election. They would take members from across society and figure out exactly how long it's going to take to vote that ballot. In doing so, then that can help you plan. The next thing is looking at relevant data again. We have a U.S. Senate seat in Tennessee 6 years ago. It wasn't contested. Well, it was contested, but pretty much nominal competition in Tennessee for that. We haven't had an open Senate seat in a decade. So the tendency is to look at 6 years ago and see what turnout would be. Frankly, I think that's wrong. I think you've got to look back to 12 years ago to where we actually had a contested race, money was being spent, and I truly believe that candidates spending money, there's a correlation with turnout. That helps get the vote out, or at least it does in Tennessee. So I think that's important. It's important to know what happened 6 years ago, but it's more important to know what happened 12 years ago. But as Neal said, you've also got to, so now you have that data, you have that information, but you also got to look at what's the voter registration trends there, and you got to adapt that data accordingly. Number of voters, obviously that's going to be how you plan. It was amazing. We had a new administrator come in one time several years ago. They had, by way of example, they had 10 precincts and they had 30 machines, and I'm simplifying this, and in their mind they sent 3 voting machines to each precinct. Well, that's not how it works, because some of your precincts are going to have more voters, other precincts are going to have less, and like I say, sometimes that ballot may be a little different in the different jurisdictions that you have. Age of voters. Now, I have some administrators, I guarantee this would happen, and it's a great thing that I have this. I'm blessed with this. So we have 95 counties, and some of our administrators analyze everything. And so if we were doing a tabletop exercise, we have some communities that are senior living centers or senior areas, like Fairfield Glade. It's a very popular area in Tennessee. A lot of seniors live there. Well, when I hit 40, I can't read a ballot without glasses. I need something to magnify those. And so we saw that was an issue in polling locations. So we sent glasses out to the polling locations. Now, if I have a polling location that's located close to the University of Tennessee, I look at the data. It may only be college students voting there. Well, I don't have to send as many glasses. But in Fairfield Glade, I'm probably going to need to send more glasses. Now, I will tell you, if you choose to do that, and this is serious, if you choose to do that as a state, or if you want to provide those glasses, find the ugliest glasses you can find, because those glasses will walk away. I see that we're getting timed up here, so I see that I need to speed along. But obviously, absentee requests that can show you what type of turnout you may have. Trends are very important. I've learned that voters, just like anything else, creatures of habit. And I saw this Sunday with my own family. My son Brody and Noah, we going to church, and we sit on the opposite side. We typically sit on the right side. We sit on the left side. And one of my sons looked at me and said, "Hey, we're sitting on the wrong side." He's a creature of habit. Voters, at least in Tennessee, tend to be creatures of habit. If you look at this, the blue line is our presidential preference primary. Normally for early voting, we're going to have between 40 to 60%. 60%, it's almost dead on. If you look, 66% last year, 4 years before that, 60%, and 4 years before that, 60%. So we know when we're planning our elections, early voting for a presidential election, we're going to have about 60%. So we need to bulk up our early voting sites, make sure we have enough workers there. For a presidential preference primary, look how consistent it is, 30%. So it's just the opposite. So then you need to bulk up on election day. You don't need to be bulking up on during early voting. Well, I have that data. So I also like to get behind that data. Why is it only 30%? Why does that buck the trend? Well, for a presidential preference primary, we're not New Hampshire, we're not Iowa, we're later on in the process. And so what happens, candidates start dropping out. We start early voting 20 days before the election. By the time early voting is continued, half the candidates are gone. Well, voters want their vote to count, so they wait until the election day to vote. Here's where this will catch some individuals, and we've seen it happen in Tennessee. Although I went over this in one of our training exercises, always compare elections to elections. Presidential, don't go 2 years before, because it's different. Go 4 years before. And we had an individual that looked at the 60% as opposed to the 30% in preparing for a presidential preference primary. They thought, this is 60%, but it was really 30%. So they thought they were going to have a very low turnout. By the time it came to election day, they were caught off guard. So you got to know exactly what data is relevant. You know, Sir Francis Bacon is quoted with saying, "Knowledge is power." I'm going to give him an amendment. I'm going to give him an assist today. I think that data is knowledge, and knowledge is power.
Thanks, Mark. While the audience gets their questions together, I thought what I'd do is I'd go down the row and ask each of our panelists a question that's pegged to their presentation. And actually, I'm going to start, although Mark just presented, I'm going to start with him, because I think the question I'll give to Neal couple of y'all might want to weigh in. Although I'll actually preface my question to Mark by saying, with respect to ugly glasses, you must not have a whole lot of hipsters in Tennessee, because I have imagined that in some places, the uglier the glasses, the more likely they would be stolen. The question I want to ask was this about Mark. So one of the things that you learn when you study, get to know election administrators well, is that election administrators are natural emergency planners. And if they're not election administrators for very long. And that's been known for a long, long time. The Defending Digital Democracy program at the Belfer Center at Harvard, which you mentioned, has introduced the election administration world to this genre of emergency planning, of tabletop exercises. I'm wondering if you could just reflect on how those tabletop exercises differ for what you see as being kind of traditional emergency planning, and what sorts of information or experiences that they give to election administrators that maybe more traditional ways of emergency planning have lacked in the past.
Yeah, so I think the difference between the tabletop exercise that we did is the emergencies happened. And so now how do you react? The typical way we were preparing was we would prepare a plan and we didn't execute that plan. So during the tabletop exercise, it forces you to put that plan in action. And if you don't have a plan, or if you didn't think of something in that plan, then you need to go back and adapt that plan.
Right. Great. So Melissa, you might have, I imagine your world is full of tabletop exercises, so you might have some thoughts about that. One of the things I was wondering about as you were talking was I was thinking about the old Sesame Street game, which of these is not like the others, or maybe the opposite, which is, to what degree is planning around an election, how is that pre-planning for contingencies that might come up? Are there any other large-scale events in the state that are like that? And then in what way, so what are the similar other events that maybe folks could kind of get their heads around? And then in what ways are planning for, if in your world, planning for an election different from a typical large-scale event that might be in the public's mind?
Well, we'll exercise.
Get it close.
Just in case. I need to tell my father that they had to do that. We'll exercise for a number of different things, both in tabletop and then actually by activating the CRCC and having our agency representatives or AREPs come in. It will be for power plant exercises and things along those lines. It will also be for weather events. We always do a spring weather and a winter weather exercise just prior to that season. But really, when it comes down to preparing for responding to an election, we do what we do best, which is coordinate. PEMA doesn't save lives, but we coordinate. So we make sure that all the agencies and the resources are talking to one another, and that we're a kind of a conduit, if you will, for that information to be able to flow. We've sat down together and worked some smaller scale election scenarios prior to Election Day, and we're hoping to kind of be able to build onto that. And the next step of that is actually bringing more of the county emergency management coordinators and 911 and election directors together to kind of practice that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Great.
Ben, I'd like to have you talk a bit more about a topic that you touched on, and that has to do with one could derisively call the demographic profiling dangers of the sorts of exercise that you're dealing with. So when you're building a model of the sort that you talked about, how do you ensure that the downside of that sort of modeling doesn't infect the types of decisions that get made?
Yeah, there's a wonderful book out there, and I'd highly recommend any election administrator who wants to be data-driven to look at it. It's called Weapons of Math Destruction. And it's a nice critique of the use of big data and these types of modeling and analytics. What happens, so just understand that these types of analytics aren't creating patterns. They're discovering patterns for you. But ask yourselves the question, who created the patterns? It's your human employees. So in the case of poll workers, it's your recruiters that are using their own, I use the word intuition. Another word that could be used is bias. And it could be explicit, hopefully not, but it could very likely be implicit bias. So that individual poll worker are making decisions, human decisions that are trying to yield the best outcomes that they can yield. But over time and aggregated together, there are going to be patterns that exist that could lend themselves to what I think Charles is talking about. So out of curiosity, when you look at your poll workers, anyone look at the age demographic of the likely poll worker? Older. Yeah, older. Now, the question ultimately is, without passing any judgment, still a question though, is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? In terms of planning for future elections, well, if all your workers are at the cusp of retirement or already retired, that may not be a good thing, right? You may not have those, God forbid, you may not have a large number of those poll workers for the next election. So for logistic planning, maybe there needs to be some effort spent on recruiting other demographic, right? But again, without getting into making those judgment calls of do we go after this demographic or not, and that's probably not even that good of an idea to choose a certain demographic. But it's important to use these types of algorithms to uncover whether there has been some sort of pattern in the way things have done before, because that's what this algorithm's doing. It's uncovering those patterns. And if you could dig into the data using some of these algorithms, you could start realizing and potentially even reversing some of the previous behaviors that your employees have used to recruit certain individuals. So this addressed that first question I brought up in terms of the inherent danger to this. If using advanced data analytics is used purely blindly, to say, hey, let's just get high performance, then you, as an election administrator, are at a risk of just reproducing the same patterns, but optimized, by this algorithm that you may not want. So the way to combat some of those things is to dig into the data and ask yourselves, are these the patterns that we want to continue? And if they're not, great, you've just used a tool that uncovered patterns that may have been done unwittingly. And then you could start addressing the way you go about conducting, whether it's poll worker selection, precinct selection, any decision making that you have. If there are patterns to it and you want to know what those patterns are, and you want to make a judgment as an election administrator, then those tools will be available to help you make better decisions in that way.
And then Neal, I wanted to ask you about just the kind of the resources needed to become the next Neal Kelley. Or maybe I'll make a comment and then pose the question another way. I mean, I think Orange County really is an exemplar in terms of using data, and not just using data, but communicating it effectively to the public. And doing so requires a set of skills. And not everyone is the 5th largest jurisdiction in America. So if you were like the 1,000th or the 500th largest jurisdiction in America, or the 6,000th largest jurisdiction, and you wanted to play in this game, where does one get the types of tools and expertise in order to do the sorts of things that you all have been able to do, maybe at a smaller scale, but nonetheless begin to play in this game?
Well, thank you, Charles. I don't know if that was a slight or if that is a compliment. I'll take it as a compliment. All right. That's a great question. I get it all the time. I think the one thing I always tell people is that what we're doing is scalable. So there's a lot of tools that are available online that can be utilized for the same types of data collection and data analysis that we're doing very simply. And I think that smaller jurisdictions that may not have the funding or the resources can do at least half of what we're doing with online tutorials and online tools. There's a lot of that out there. It's very useful right now. I also encourage folks to utilize, this is a great place to say this, a community college, because There's some great classes on operations management that dive right into this very specific topic and how to handle logistics and data. And if you took a weekend course or even a 6-month course, that's really helpful because it talks about queuing and line management and logistics, which is very useful. But I do want to just emphasize, Charles, because I'm glad you asked the question, that it's just not about money and about resources. For instance, on the social media side, all of that is done probably in a negative way. My family certainly says that by myself, because I'm able to send that communication out, and I do that. So if I can do it by myself, others can do it. We don't have a team like Los Angeles County does.
Ooh. Okay, I have some other questions that I could ask, but I think we'd like to turn it over to the audience. It looks like we have some microphones around, and I will try to call on people as they raise their hands. And so what questions do you all have? There's one right here.
Hi, I'm Kara Ron from Chester County. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
An election director here in Pennsylvania. My question is for the two gentlemen from California, just so that we can try to understand from a poll worker perspective, what are the laws or the rules in California or restrictions that you may have on who can and can't be a poll worker, and then also who has the authority to fill those roles?
So thank you for the question. So in California right now, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen to be a poll worker. You can be a legal permanent resident, and we, in Orange County, just as an example, I support 6 languages in the county, and that becomes very handy because we can't always find poll workers that are U.S. citizens that are willing to come and do that bilingual support. So we have the LPR as an alternative. We also have a student poll worker program. You have to be 16 with a 2.5 GPA. With the permission of your school and your parent, and we utilize about 2,000 of those folks in Orange County to support. Ben touched on it a little bit. Our population is aging, which I'm sure it is the same in your jurisdiction. Our average age right now is 67. When I first started, it was 72, so that's dropping because we're putting more young folks into the mix. But I find that it's a good balance to have the older folks and the younger folks in a polling place as opposed to all young. And that's is really helpful. So hopefully that addresses. No, they're not. And let me touch on that real quick. So obviously in some jurisdictions you have to have the mix between the Republicans and the Dems, and we don't have any of those restrictions in California. It's open recruitment. They're not elected. And we also allow our inspectors to help recruit their own individual teams if they want to do that as well. I have to recruit 10,000 poll workers for each countywide election. Our team has to do that. So it's a very daunting task. So we rely on some of them to help with that recruitment.
So just as a follow-up, I think that's what makes using this type of data so much easier, because we don't have those restrictions. We could literally go after anyone. For us, I know the limitation of the algorithm that we use is using voting history. So we generally are targeting folks that are LA County voters, but we do have plenty of poll workers that are from Orange County that commute, because we also have the county poll worker program, which you guys might have as well. And we have Orange County residents that work in LA County, and so we borrow from LA County other departments to staff the polls. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's nice not to have any of those types of issues to stop an algorithm from trying to optimize, because you keep adding in more restrictions, then the question is, how much optimization can you really squeeze out, from what you're already doing?
Great, thanks. I'll just make a comment as somebody who's not around here but has done a couple of things in Pennsylvania around elections. It is interesting that inevitably there's the question about, well, do you elect your poll workers? And so I've taken that to be an issue here in Pennsylvania. There's a question here far to my right.
Yes, good morning. This is Suzanne Erb from Disability Rights Pennsylvania. And one of the things that I think is important to remember in terms of data, and that isn't always, doesn't always come up, is voters who have disabilities. And in terms of the discussion that has just taken place, what efforts, can you describe what safeguards are in place to ensure that the ability to, for people with all abilities to vote independently and have a verifiable paper ballot, and also to have a private vote are in place? One of the problems that seems to come up very often in terms of polling place accessibility has not just only to do with polling place accessibility itself, but also the ability of poll workers to use the machines and to set the machines up so that people who have disabilities can cast independent and private ballots. I know that that has been a concern of mine on various occasions when I've voted, and that affects not only my vote, but also lines. If the machines don't work properly, it affects lines, it affects everything. Could someone please address that for me? Thank you.
I'm sure we have several other panelists who'd like to hop in. I'll call. Go. Start with Neal. Then I'm going to call Mark.
Thank you for your question. I'm glad to hear that Disability Rights Pennsylvania is here. I do a lot of work with Disability Rights California in Orange County, very close work. One of the things that I have struggled with and that I would like to be able to get my hands on is data on the number of voters with disabilities, and that's a very difficult data point to try and capture. And we've had a lot of discussions with Disability Rights California regarding that. One of the things that we do, though, to ensure that voters with disabilities can cast their ballot privately and independently with a paper trail is we offer all of those things in Orange County, so that each polling place is set up with a disabled access unit or more, depending on the voter density, that allows voters with disabilities to cast their ballot with all the tools available on that unit with a paper backup trail that they can verify. We also provide ballot calls so that if a voter cannot exit a vehicle or they're outside, they can push a doorbell and we will bring the voting booth to them so that they can vote in their vehicle. But again, I want to go back to the data because of this being a data summit. If you have information or ways to capture that data, I would love to talk with you because I think that's really important for us to be able to focus more resources in that area.
Mark, if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, Neal is correct. Each polling location, so we're a little different system in Tennessee where we still primarily rely on DREs, so we haven't truly gone to the paper ballots, what the few counties have. But even the paper ballot counties, we make sure that there is an accessible unit that's there. One thing, it is a challenge to try to figure out what numbers are utilizing those systems, but part of that challenge we self-create. We don't want just one person using that machine. So we will, although it is a machine that typically is for those that need that accommodation, we try to get other voters to go there as well because we're always concerned about protecting how that individual voted. So if you have one unit and only one voter is voting on that, then that could create problems of its own self. Plus, we just don't want to single anyone out. But we also have a very good relationship with two organizations that focus on disabilities. There's someone typically at our state election commission meetings there. We also have bell calls, and we also do our best to supply the precincts with various things. One thing we did do, we created probably 4 years ago, working with at the time it was Disability Law and Advocacy Group. We worked with them and created some training and a handbook for our poll officials. And we did that with them, working from their point of view, and we incorporated that in our training. We've continued to do so since 2014, maybe 2012.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss in not giving a plug to my previous boss's massive project that they're doing in LA County, which is the VSAT project. This is the Voting Systems for All People. I know that at its core, in terms of working with disability rights groups, much of the work that was done in actually designing the machines and designing the experience was very much tailored to addressing many of those concerns that those community advocates had in being able to provide that type of, good experience at the polls. Obviously, it's a different problem when we're talking about vote by mail, and there are different necessary solutions to think about that. But as for the data as well, we have looked at different data sets, and it's imperfect out there. One can look at Census Bureau data, even down to the census tract, even group block level, try to massage that up against, the citizen voting age population data, and try to get a better understanding of your voters in these areas, which ones have the greatest need. And so there's possibility for that, but it's, again, very imperfect. The Census Bureau data is not presented to the public or even to election administrators at the individual level, and so we can't know all those things that we'd like to know, about our voters. But there are things that are out there that you can use to join data together and get some approximation. And so those are things that we've begun doing as well.
Charles, can I have one quick? Yes. I just want to add, I'm actually a little ashamed to admit this, that we had not been doing this before 2018, and that is to bring in Disability Rights California and other groups into our poll worker training, to have them speak to the poll workers and to talk to them. It's actually the trainers that are doing the poll worker training, to talk to them about sensitivities and how to work with voters with disabilities. And it's actually been great, and I'm just ashamed we haven't been doing it for years before.
Do we have, over here? And actually, while we're waiting, actually the microphone is there, I'm going to prime my panelists. I want them at the end to list very quickly one resource that you would like to turn this group on to that hasn't been mentioned yet, but you just think it's great that people should know about. So, Jessica.
Hello, my name is Jessica Hoosman. I am a reporter with ProPublica, and I cover elections and voting. And we are undertaking round 2 of Election Land this year, which is a project that aims to train local reporters on how to report on elections themselves responsibly and accurately during early voting and on election day. And so one thing that I would really like our reporters to do is sort of establish a relationship with their local election administrators. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips for, maybe things that reporters miss or things that they can do to start preparing now to cover elections in your area or across the country better and more responsibly than they usually do on election day.
Who wants to bite first? Should we just go down the list? We'll start with Mark.
Could you summarize that question again? I'm sorry, I'm not fully understanding your question.
She speaks with a foreign accent,
Maybe.
and so.
So what we're trying to do is sort of help reporters understand the resources that they have available to them, so that
Okay.
when a voter comes to them and said, I have this really big problem, my polling place, like the machine was broken or there's vote flipping, they know how to respond to that, and they don't just report on whatever they have understood from the voter. So we're wondering if, you can give us some tips about, can reporters come to your polling place now and take a look at the machines? Can they get better information from you on how, what mistakes you expect to see on election day that are pretty normal and that your poll workers are trained to deal with, so that they can give that information back to voters in a responsible way on election day?
Yeah, and that is a good point where we messed up on our tabletop exercise. After we did our tabletop exercise, a reporter found out about it and said, why didn't you invite us? And actually, I think that would have been a good opportunity on our behalf to instill voter confidence, because all they're hearing in the news are negative things about the election process currently. But in Tennessee, it's a little different, maybe than in some other states, or maybe it's the same. For our process, when the voting machines are being tested, anyone can come in and view that. It's an open process for the machines to be tested. So reporters are certainly welcome. Notice is typically given to the local media that's happening. So that's always something that can happen. On election night, we always want reporters to come to this. Sometimes reporters will reach out to us and say they'd like to come to the state and see what the results look like as they're coming in. For us, it really doesn't help them, because we're looking at a computer terminal where someone's entering it in a portal. So it may be better suited to go to the local election commission office where you can view those things. But the main thing is, I guess, from a media standpoint, what can help election officials. It is amazing what the voter perceives, and sometimes it's driven from what they're hearing, and maybe it's because it's politically charged of what's going on in the election. Before a headline's given or written, it'd be awesome if the reporter would reach out to someone in elections to get the know. And it may be that that election official doesn't instantly know what's going on. So if we could have a little period to research it and come back, that, in my experience, that's the things that's kind of hurt us a little bit, is the headline would say one thing and it's totally wrong. And sometimes it's because they've called an election official and the media has to get that information out there, and the election official gives an answer and they haven't researched it on their end.
If reporters want to know about covering kind of the emergency preparedness aspect in Pennsylvania and other places, what should they be doing?
As far as the emergency preparedness aspect of things, and we'd suggest that, you know, the 12 million plus population in Pennsylvania do this on a regular basis anyhow. But social media is so crucial right now. When we want to find something out and what's happening right now, somebody's tweeting whether or not it's pouring down rain. So you're going to see that. So find your social media resources. Follow us at PIMA on Facebook, on Twitter. The PIMA director has a handle as well that you can do that at. To kind of go back towards a little bit of my days at Department of State, if I may be so bold as to jump in on that one a little bit, is really have, as a reporter, a comprehension of Election 101. Your county election offices, as well as the Department of State, have spent a tremendous amount of time with a lot of really talented people to explain that process, how everything works, allow email, phone calls. You can come in and ask those kinds of questions and find out exactly how it works in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and what those things mean, guidances, other things along those lines. And you can find a lot of that on the county and the state's website. So if I could suggest that, that's a great possibility.
Tips to reporters.
So I think, to echo some of what Mark has said, I would love it if reporters, especially reporting on elections, were just much more data savvy. And I say that in the sense of most of the data that we use is of public information, and anyone can have accessibility to it. But sometimes, you know, some folks don't understand that what data in one table or one source means one thing, but in a different area or a different, if you're looking at something else, it means a whole other thing as well. And so I would imagine, at least with LA County, there's always a group that is looking at this data, and if you can make that connection in the event that you have questions about, well, what does this actually mean? I'm looking at this data that's posted on your website. It looks odd, or turnout doesn't look right. Sometimes there's errors that the county elections office can make, and those are all useful things to bring to the attention of, you know, the administrator. But it could be very frustrating, I would imagine, at least from when I look at things, when certain, you know, things are being reported and the context is often completely mischaracterized, or the data doesn't actually support the conclusions that are being presented, which then lead to, you know, misperception by the voters and so on and so forth.
I have a very specific example for you. Ask your reporters, or the reporters you know, to build a relationship with the election official, and then ask them if they can ride along on election day for the emergency response teams. That has been really helpful on our side. David Whiting is a Orange County Register columnist. He recently did it with me. Just Google that, or even our regular response teams, because they see what we have to deal with on election day, and it provides a new perspective for them.
Great. So as a way of wrapping up the lightning round, one resource really quickly down the table, and then we're standing between these people and lunch. So, Neal, one resource.
Real quick, Hootsuite, many of you might be familiar with this, social media aggregator. Get all of your social media tools into one location. It really helps collecting data and what's happening on election day and pre-election day.
Datacamp.com, and I say this, most of us in this room who run an election do not have the budget to go out and hire a data scientist. I think that's for real. But a site like datacamp.com, in the hands of staff that already have interest in doing the type of data analytics that you'd want to do, that will upskill those folks in a very, very fast way. And I make the suggestion to do this because the democratization of data science is happening very fast. And there are lots of citizen data scientists that are out there that are looking at the public data that we all have. And if we're not looking at the patterns and we're not analyzing what's going on in terms of the services that we're providing, someone else is definitely doing that. And it'd be better for you to uncover these things than someone else that has a very critical eye as to what is being done.
Melissa.
I know we're talking data, but I would say people. Make sure one of the things we're finding, you're connecting with your folks, both at the state level, PEMA and Department of State, as well as the county level, because they can provide you with the information, the statistics, the material, the data, to be able to be responsive on election day should an emergency happen within your county. And so I would say first your people, and then they can provide you with the data to be able to do what you need to do in a time of an emergency.
Mark.
The second thing I read every morning is electionline.org. And I think you can go through there, you can see what's going on in other states, but also like today, there was a helpful article about looking at maps and using various things. So electionline.org.
Great. Well, thanks to the panel and thanks to the audience. And, well, we should give these guys an applause. So what now? 1 hour for lunch, you're on your own, come back in an hour. It's going to be even better.